What happens when two of Britain's most outspoken personalities collide in a battle of egos that spirals so far out of control that security has to get involved? It only took 30 seconds for Ricky Gervais to get kicked off Piers Morgan's show after a heated argument that left the entire studio absolutely stunned. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation, make sure you subscribe to the channel for daily videos exposing Hollywood's darkest scandals. Hit that subscribe button now, because you won't want to miss what we uncover next. Last night's episode of Piers Morgan Uncensored was supposed to feature another one of those entertaining exchanges between two personalities who've sparred publicly for years. These two have a history of trading barbs on social media, always with that edge of friendly competition mixed with genuine irritation. People tune in to watch Ricky and Piers go at each other because they know it's going to be spicy, controversial, and probably a little bit uncomfortable. But what unfolded on live television went far beyond their usual back and forth. This wasn't playful banter anymore. This was personal. This was vicious. And this was about to explode in the most dramatic way possible. Everyone who knows these two personalities understands they're both alpha males who don't back down easily. Piers has made a career out of being confrontational, asking tough questions, and never apologizing for his opinions. Ricky has built his reputation on saying exactly what he thinks, pushing boundaries, and refusing to be censored by anyone. Put those two forces in the same room, and you're already playing with fire. Add in some genuine animosity that's been building for years, and you've got a recipe for absolute disaster. The tension was visible from the very first moment Ricky walked onto the set. Usually when these two get together, there's at least some pretense of cordiality, some acknowledgement that despite their differences, they're both professionals doing a job. Not this time. Ricky's face was set in a hard expression as he made his way to his seat, barely acknowledging the audience's applause. His walk was stiff, purposeful, like someone heading into battle rather than a casual chat. Piers greeted him with his trademark smug grin, extending his hand for a shake, but even that simple gesture felt loaded with tension. You could see in Piers's eyes that he knew something was different tonight, that Ricky wasn't in the mood for their usual dance. The handshake itself was brief, almost dismissive. You could see in both their body language that something was already wrong before a single word was spoken. Ricky's grip was firm to the point of aggressive, and he pulled his hand away quickly, as if the contact itself was distasteful. Ricky sat down heavily in his chair, not bothering with the usual pleasantries or small talk that typically starts these interviews. He didn't compliment the set, didn't thank Piers for having him on, didn't make any of those automatic social gestures that guests usually offer. Piers noticed the coldness immediately, his smile faltering slightly as he settled back into his own seat. The host's eyes narrowed, recognizing that tonight was going to be different from their previous encounters. Piers opened by welcoming Ricky to the show and mentioning his latest Netflix special. The words were friendly enough on the surface, but there was an edge to his tone, a sharpness that suggested he was already preparing for battle. He made a comment about how Ricky always manages to stir up controversy, said with a smile but carrying an unmistakable undertone of criticism. Ricky thanked him flatly, his voice completely devoid of warmth or enthusiasm. There was no smile, no attempt to charm the audience or play along with the expected rhythm of the interview. The audience could sense something was off, that electric energy of anticipation mixed with discomfort spreading through the studio like wildfire. Then Piers made his first real move. He brought up a recent controversy, a joke from Ricky's latest special that had sparked debate online. The way he framed it wasn't as a genuine question about the comedian's creative process, but as an accusation barely disguised as inquiry. He suggested that maybe Ricky had crossed a line this time, that perhaps the comedian was so obsessed with being edgy that he'd lost sight of basic decency. He spoke with that condescending tone that Piers does so well, as if he was a parent scolding a misbehaving child. The implication was clear. Ricky had gone too far, and Piers was here to hold him accountable. Ricky's jaw tightened immediately. His eyes narrowed as he looked directly at Piers, and when he spoke, his voice was ice cold. He told Piers that he found it rich getting lectures about decency from someone who built an entire career on being deliberately inflammatory. He said at least when he pushes boundaries, he does it in the service of comedy, in service of making people think and laugh. He said what Piers does, which is just contrarianism for its own sake. That's not brave or interesting, that's just noise. He wasn't shouting, wasn't raising his voice, but the contempt in his tone was unmistakable. The audience gasped at the directness of the insult. This wasn't the witty banter they'd expected, the playful sparring that usually characterized these encounters. This was a direct attack, delivered with surgical precision and genuine malice. Piers's face flushed slightly, color rising in his cheeks, but he tried to laugh it off, saying something about Ricky being as sensitive as ever. But his voice had an edge now, too, the pretense of friendliness completely gone. You could hear the anger creeping into his words, see it in the way his shoulders tensed. Ricky leaned forward in his chair, his voice rising for the first time. He told Piers not to mistake honesty for sensitivity. He said the problem with Piers is that he dishes out criticism constantly, makes a living tearing people down, but the second someone pushes back even slightly, he crumbles. He said it's pathetic, watching a grown man play the victim every time someone challenges him. He brought up specific instances where Piers had complained publicly about being criticized, moments that clearly still stung based on how Piers's expression changed. The comedian's words were precise, calculated to hurt, and they were landing every time. Piers shot back immediately, his voice louder now, any pretense of maintaining journalistic objectivity completely abandoned. He said that was rich coming from someone who spends half his time on Twitter blocking people who disagree with him. He suggested that Ricky talks a big game about free speech and open debate, but only when it's speech he agrees with, only when it's people saying things that align with his worldview. He called Ricky a hypocrite, hiding behind comedy while being just as thin-skinned as anyone else. The accusation hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and years of built-up resentment finally being voiced. Ricky laughed, but it was a cold, bitter sound that echoed through the studio. He told Piers there's a massive difference between blocking trolls and crying to the press every time someone hurts your feelings. He brought up specific instances where Piers had complained publicly about criticism, about being treated unfairly, about how hard his job was. He said Piers positions himself as this tough, no-nonsense journalist who asks the hard questions, but really he's just a professional whiner who can't handle his own medicine. The words cut deep. You could see it in how Piers's face was reddening, how his hands were gripping the edge of his desk. The host's face was reddening now, his composure starting to crack in real time. He told Ricky that at least he has the courage to stand by his opinions in public, that he doesn't hide behind comedy as an excuse when things get heated. He said Ricky's whole persona is built on being able to say whatever he wants and then claiming it's just jokes when people object. He accused the comedian of being a coward, using humor as a shield so he never has to actually defend his positions or face real consequences for his words. The accusation was clearly designed to provoke, and it worked perfectly. That comment clearly struck a nerve. Ricky's voice went quiet, which somehow felt more threatening than when he'd been loud. The studio went completely silent, everyone leaning forward to hear what he'd say next. He told Piers very clearly that comedy requires more courage than anything Piers has ever done in his entire career. He said making people laugh while also making them think, making them uncomfortable in productive ways, making them question their assumptions, that takes actual skill and bravery. He said what Piers does, which is just being contrarian for attention, saying inflammatory things for clicks and views. A child could do that. A particularly stupid child, but still. The insult landed like a bomb. Piers slammed his hand on the desk, the sound echoing through the studio like a gunshot. Several people in the audience actually jumped at the sudden noise. He told Ricky he was being incredibly disrespectful, that he was a guest on this show and needed to show some damn courtesy. The swear words seemed to surprise even Piers himself, an acknowledgement that he'd lost control of his temper, that the professional mask had completely slipped. His breathing was heavy now, his face fully flushed with anger. Ricky stood up from his chair, and the entire studio went silent. The movement was sudden, deliberate, commanding everyone's attention. He looked down at Piers and told him he'd show courtesy when Piers showed some integrity. He said he only came on this show because his publicist thought it would be good promotion, but now he remembered exactly why he'd been avoiding it for so long. He called Piers a tabloid journalist, playing dress-up as a serious interviewer, pretending to be Edward R. Murrow when really he's just Jerry Springer with a nicer suit. The comparison clearly infuriated Piers. You could see his whole body tense with rage. Piers stood up too, both men now on their feet, facing each other across the desk like boxers in a ring. His voice was shaking with anger when he responded, barely able to contain his fury. He told Ricky that at least he works for a living, that at least he doesn't just stand on stage making the same tired observations about religion and celebrities that have been done to death by better comedians. He said Ricky hasn't had an original thought in years, that he's been coasting on his reputation while producing increasingly lazy material. The insult was clearly designed to hurt, to strike at Ricky's professional pride. The insult about his comedy seemed to be the breaking point for Ricky. His face went completely cold, and when he spoke, every word was measured and deliberate, each one landing like a physical blow. He told Piers that his Netflix specials reach more people in a day than this show reaches in a month. He said the only reason Piers even has a platform anymore is because he's willing to say outrageous things for attention, and eventually that well runs dry. He said Piers's career is built on controversy, not talent, and everyone knows it. The difference between them, Ricky said, is that people will still care about his work decades from now, while Piers will be a footnote remembered only for being annoying. Piers responded by telling Ricky to get the hell off his show. His voice was loud enough that it must have been heard clearly even in the back of the studio, probably even in the hallways outside. He said he'd given Ricky a platform to promote his work, treated him with respect despite their differences, despite all their past conflicts, and this was the thanks he got. He called Ricky ungrateful and arrogant, accused him of being incapable of showing basic human decency even for an hour. His voice was breaking with emotion now, genuine hurt, mixing with the anger. Ricky laughed in his face, and it was one of the most dismissive sounds imaginable. He told Piers he didn't need his platform, never had, never would. He said this show was a favor to Piers, if anything, giving him some actual credibility by having a real artist sit across from him. The word artist was delivered with particular emphasis, dripping with sarcasm, making it clear Ricky didn't consider Piers to be anywhere near that category. He said Piers should be thanking him for even showing up, for giving this failing show a ratings boost. The host was practically vibrating with rage now, his entire body rigid with barely controlled fury. He pointed toward the exit and told Ricky to leave right now, before he had security remove him physically. His voice had gone from angry to genuinely threatening, all professional courtesy completely abandoned. You could see producers in the background starting to move, unsure whether to intervene or let this play out, looking at each other with panic in their eyes. Ricky stepped back from the desk, spreading his arms wide in a theatrical gesture that was clearly designed to mock Piers even further. He told the studio audience they just witnessed what happens when you challenge someone who can dish it out but absolutely cannot take it. He said Piers had spent years building a reputation as a tough interviewer, who asks hard questions, who doesn't back down, who speaks truth to power. But the second someone actually pushed back against him, actually challenged his authority, he completely fell apart like a house of cards. He said it was almost sad to watch if it wasn't so predictable. Piers was shouting now, telling Ricky to get out, his face purple with rage, looking like he might actually have a stroke right there on camera. He told security to escort the comedian out of the building immediately if he didn't leave voluntarily in the next 5 seconds. The veins in his neck were visible, pulsing with each angry word. His entire body was tense with barely controlled fury, hands clenched into fists. Several security personnel were indeed moving toward the stage now, though they seemed uncertain about exactly what they were supposed to do, never having been in quite this situation before. Ricky started walking toward the exit, but he couldn't resist one final comment. He turned back and told Piers that this meltdown would be all over social media within minutes, probably seconds. He said everyone would see exactly how the great confrontational journalist handles being confronted himself, how quickly he crumbles when faced with someone who won't be intimidated. He suggested it was the most honest moment Piers had ever had on television, even if it was completely unintentional. He said at least viewers were finally seeing the real Piers Morgan, the man behind the carefully constructed persona. That sent Piers over the edge completely. He launched into a string of profanity that would definitely require heavy editing before broadcast, words that you rarely hear on television, even on cable. He told Ricky never to come back, that he was banned from the show permanently, that he'd rather interview literally anyone else on the planet, even people he despises. His rage was so complete that his words started becoming incoherent, just angry sounds mixed with curses and half-formed insults. Spit was flying from his mouth as he shouted, his face contorted with fury. Ricky just smiled, that infuriating grin that said he'd accomplished exactly what he'd set out to do. He told Piers he'd rather stick needles in his eyes than sit across from him ever again anyway, that this whole experience had been like trying to have a meaningful conversation with a brick wall. He said doing this interview was like trying to have a meaningful conversation with a particularly aggressive talk radio host who'd somehow gotten a television show despite having nothing interesting to say. He thanked Piers sarcastically for reminding him why he usually avoids these kinds of shows, these kinds of hosts who think being loud and obnoxious is the same thing as being interesting or important. The audience was in complete shock, some people with their mouths literally hanging open in disbelief. Others were looking around at each other, trying to process what they were witnessing, wondering if this was somehow planned, or if they were actually seeing two famous people have a genuine meltdown on live television. A few appeared to be filming on their phones, holding them up despite knowing security would likely confiscate those recordings later. The atmosphere in the studio had gone from tense to absolutely chaotic, with nobody quite sure what was supposed to happen next. Piers threw his show notes across the desk in a fit of rage, papers flying everywhere like snow in a blizzard. Some landed on the floor, others scattered across the desk. One even flew into the audience. He was beyond coherent speech now, just pointing furiously at the door with a shaking hand, his whole body trembling with the intensity of his anger. The crew members were frozen, some still filming because nobody had told them to stop, others looking to the producers for guidance on whether they should cut to commercial or keep rolling. This was unprecedented territory for everyone involved. Ricky gave a little wave to the cameras as he reached the studio doors, that cheeky grin still plastered on his face. He thanked the audience for their time, said they'd been lovely despite the host being an absolute nightmare to deal with, a complete disaster of a human being. He made a joke about how he'd rather do literally anything else than spend another minute in Piers Morgan's presence, maybe root canal surgery or watch paint dry. Then he pushed through the doors without looking back, leaving them swinging in his wake, the sound echoing through the stunned studio. Behind him, Piers was trying to regain some composure, but it was clearly impossible. His chest was still heaving with exertion and anger, sweat visible on his forehead under the hot studio lights. He attempted to address the camera, to say something to salvage the situation, to somehow spin this disaster into something less catastrophic. But his voice was still shaking with anger, trembling with emotion. He couldn't form complete sentences, just fragments of thoughts mixed with continued insults directed at Ricky's retreating form. He called him names that would need to be bleeped out, questioned his character, his talent, his entire existence. The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence after Ricky left, broken only by Piers's heavy breathing and occasional muttered curses. Piers stood there alone at his desk, chest heaving, looking like he'd just run a marathon or been in an actual physical fight. His carefully constructed persona of the controlled, confident host had been completely shattered, demolished in a matter of minutes. Everyone watching could see that this interview had gone so catastrophically wrong that there was no recovering from it, no way to pretend it had been anything other than a complete disaster. Producers were rushing onto the set now, trying to figure out what to do next, their faces masks of panic and stress. Should they continue the show, cut to commercial, just end the broadcast entirely and go dark? The confusion was visible on everyone's faces, in their frantic gestures and hushed, urgent conversations. This wasn't something you could plan for or prepare for in any training. This was a complete disaster unfolding in real time, being broadcast to thousands of viewers who were probably recording every second on their phones and computers. Piers finally sat back down, but his movements were jerky, uncoordinated, like a puppet with tangled strings. He was still too angry to think straight, let alone continue hosting a television show with any degree of professionalism. Someone brought him water, which he gulped down without seeming to taste it, his throat working convulsively. His hands were trembling as he set the glass down, nearly missing the desk entirely. A makeup person tried to approach him to fix his appearance, but he waved them away angrily. The audience was being told to stay in their seats, that they'd be continuing shortly, but you could see the doubt on the production staff's faces as they delivered these instructions. How do you continue after something like that? How do you pretend the last few minutes didn't just completely expose the host's inability to handle genuine confrontation? How do you move forward when everyone just watched your carefully constructed show completely implode? The staff members were whispering to each other, clearly uncertain about the best path. Forward. Piers tried to smooth his hair with shaking hands, straighten his tie which had been pulled askew during his outburst, do something to reclaim his composure and professional appearance. But everyone could see he was still rattled, still processing what had just happened, still feeling the sting of Ricky's words. The man who prided himself on being unflappable, on being able to handle any guest in any situation, had been completely undone by 30 seconds of Ricky Gervais refusing to play along with the usual script. 30 seconds was all it took to demolish years of carefully constructed image. Staff members were whispering urgently to each other all around the studio, clearly debating their options in hushed but intense conversations. The show had completely derailed in the most spectacular fashion possible. The host was in no condition to continue with any degree of professionalism, and their guest had walked off in the middle of a live broadcast after one of the most heated exchanges ever captured on television. This was a publicity nightmare in the making, the kind of incident that would define both men's careers for years to come, the kind of thing that would be replayed and analyzed and memed endlessly across social media. Security had followed Ricky to ensure he actually left the premises, but they weren't needed at all. The comedian had said his piece and had no interest in prolonging the confrontation or creating any additional drama. He walked out of that studio with his head held high, knowing he'd just delivered one of the most memorable moments in talk show history, even if it wasn't quite the kind of moment anyone had planned for or anticipated. He'd come in with a purpose, executed it perfectly, and was leaving on his own terms. Inside the studio, Piers was finally starting to string coherent sentences together again, though they mostly consisted of continued insults about Ricky mixed with attempts to justify his own reaction to anyone who would listen. He was telling anyone who would listen that he'd been completely right to kick Ricky off the show, that the comedian had been impossibly rude and disrespectful from the moment he sat down, that no host should have to tolerate that kind of behavior. He was building a narrative, trying to reframe what had just happened in a way that made him look like the reasonable one, the victim of Ricky's unreasonable behavior. But everyone in that studio knew the truth. They'd all witnessed it with their own eyes. Piers had lost control, had let Ricky get under his skin so completely that he'd abandoned all professionalism and melted down on live television in spectacular fashion. No amount of post-incident spin could change what millions of viewers had just seen with their own eyes, what would be clipped and shared across every social media platform within the hour. The truth was undeniable and inescapable. The production team finally made the decision to cut to commercial, giving everyone a chance to breathe and regroup. But as the cameras cut away, you could still see Piers at his desk, head in his hands. The reality of what had just happened finally starting to sink in. This wasn't just a bad interview. This was a complete destruction of his carefully cultivated image. Ricky Gervais had walked onto that set knowing exactly what he was doing. He'd pushed every button, challenged every assertion, refused to play the game the way Piers expected. And in doing so, he'd exposed something fundamental about the host that everyone had always suspected but never quite seen, proven so definitively. When truly challenged, when someone refused to be intimidated or impressed, Piers Morgan couldn't handle it. The doors through which Ricky had exited remained closed, but they might as well have been blown off their hinges. The comedian had left a path of destruction in his wake, a studio full of shocked people, and a host whose credibility had been damaged possibly beyond repair. All in 30 seconds of television that nobody involved would ever forget.